of course.
Excellent.
Okay.
So I'll share my screen here. Hopefully, can you see that, Veronica? Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. And obviously, I should have said thank you very much for offering to do the translation this evening. It's hard work saying everything twice over. So thanks for that. And also thank you for translating the presentation into Italian so people can actually see as we go along. They'll see both versions of it. So I will get going now. So just as something that we always have to say and emphasize to people is the UK has a complicated immigration system, and it's very important to sort of try to understand certain aspects of it and about how it works, and how visa applications operate, because what we don't want to see is people applying for visas without having all the right paperwork in order and doing the right preparation, because that's what will lead to people not being successful when they apply. And of course, that's very frustrating and disappointing for people. So that's why we always say, before you start, make sure you're familiar with the rules, and that it may involve talking to someone who is an expert in immigration law, and people have to be regulated to discuss and to provide immigration services in the UK. You have to be regulated. It's an offence, a criminal offence, to provide unregulated immigration services to people. So always check the person that if you are talking to an expert, check their background, check that they do have the regulation to give you the advice.
È innanzitutto il caso di dire che le leggi di immigrazione del Regno Unito sono molto complesse, ed è innanzitutto necessario capire i requisiti, come fare domanda. Per questo è opportuno rivolgersi a un consigliere nell'immigrazione che è regolato dall'OISC, e bisogna anche ricordarsi che è un crimine dare consigli nel campo dell'immigrazione senza essere appunto regolati da questo ente, l'OISC. È importante comprendere i requisiti, come inoltrare le domande, in quanto non soddisfare dei requisiti o presentare la domanda nella maniera scorretta può portare anche ad un possibile rifiuto.
And I think just a couple of other points I'll make before I move on, is just that in most situations, it is, if you are applying for a visa, it's important to do it outside the UK, and that you would need to be granted the visa before you travel to the UK. Because if you arrive at the UK border without the visa being granted, which you can do as a European, because Europeans can come to visit the UK without a visa, but if you're coming for the purposes of entering as a resident, you do need a visa in place before you travel and arrive. Otherwise, you run the risk of being turned away at the UK border.
È importante ricordare anche che bisogna richiedere ed ottenere il visto prima di entrare nel Regno Unito, e questo è fondamentale, in quanto l'ingresso può anche venire rifiutato.
Okay. Let me go through. So we're going to cover family visas first, which is lawyers like myself will call this Appendix FM visas, because it means appendix family member. So this is the immigration route for someone wanting to sponsor a family member. Now, we're not talking about sponsoring under the EU settlement scheme. That's just probably need to be very clear about that. This is not about the right to sponsor under the EU settlement scheme. That's a different set of family members and a completely different process. So this is about sponsoring under the what's called the domestic UK rules, which is known as Appendix FM.
Noi parleremo di richieste per un visto familiare all'interno delle regole generali dell'immigrazione, e non di ricongiungimento familiare sotto l'EU Settlement Scheme. È una differenza molto importante, in quanto le categorie di familiari che possono richiedere questo visto sono completamente diverse, la procedura è diversa, e in questo caso ci sarà anche un costo. Quindi andremo a parlare di quelle che si chiamano Domestic Immigration Rules, quindi le regole dell'immigrazione all'interno del Regno Unito.
Okay, so when we look at Appendix FM, we have to identify the family relationships that you can sponsor under that. Now, today we're going to focus on partner sponsorship. So the second bullet point down tells you who is covered under the partner sponsorship, and that is your spouse and civil partner. If you're unmarried partners who've been living together at the moment, that means living together for 2 years. Or if you are the fiance or proposed civil partner of someone, then those are the partner relationships that the rules cover.
Quindi innanzitutto bisogna identificare il tipo di relazione che ti lega con il tuo sponsor. Lo sponsor è la persona che vive nel Regno Unito e ha uno status di immigrazione nel Regno Unito. Oggi ci concentreremo sui partner e come potete vedere dalla slide sono i coniugi uniti civilmente, i compagni stabili, fidanzato o futuro unito civilmente.
Okay, there are a few other family relationships, such as, and I've listed them, you can see it says parent of a child in the UK, children of partners, and something called adult dependent relatives. So there are these other family relationships covered by this Appendix FM, but unless we want to be here for the next 3 or 4 hours, we're only going to be able to focus on partners for this evening.
Ci sono delle altre categorie di familiari che sono incluse nell'Appendix FM, come il genitore di un bambino nel Regno Unito, figlio di partner o genitori di un bambino nel Regno Unito, parente adulto e dipendente, ma a meno che non vogliate stare qua per le prossime 3-4 ore, dobbiamo necessariamente concentrarci sulla categoria dei partner.
Okay, so the person who obviously is applying for the visa as the partner, they're called the applicant, but the person who will be based in the UK sponsoring them is called, unsurprisingly, the sponsor. And so we have to look at the sponsor's immigration status.
Ok, la persona che si trova nel Regno Unito si chiama sponsor, invece il richiedente si chiama applicant. Quindi bisogna vedere innanzitutto lo status di immigrazione dello sponsor nel Regno Unito.
Okay, so the sponsoring party, they need to be either a British or Irish citizen. They either need to be settled in the UK, and in that context, settled includes someone with settled status, or they need to hold some other type of qualifying immigration status, and that sometimes can include someone with pre-settled status, but I'll explain that one a bit more.
Quindi lo sponsor deve essere o cittadino britannico o irlandese, avere lo status di settled nel Regno Unito, oppure possedere un altro tipo di status di immigrazione che in alcuni casi può essere pre-settled status, ma questo Chris lo spiegherà meglio più avanti.
Okay, so with pre-settled status, if you want to be a sponsor and you have pre-settled status, you can only be a sponsor if you arrived in the UK by the end of December 2020. So you have pre-settled status based on coming to the UK before the end of 2020. So in other words, you're not someone with pre-settled status who has been sponsored by a family member to come to the UK from 2021 onwards.
Devi avere pre-settled status per essere sponsor, ma questo pre-settled status deve essere garantito in quanto tu sei arrivato nel Regno Unito contando sui tuoi diritti prima del 31 dicembre del 2020. Quindi in poche parole hai pre-settled status perché non sei stato sponsorizzato da qualcun altro. In pratica il tuo pre-settled è basato sui tuoi diritti e non sei un joining family member.
Okay, if you are a joining family member with pre-settled status, then you can only start to sponsor family members under Appendix FM once you have been granted settled status yourself. So you have to wait probably for 5 years until you can access sponsorship under Appendix FM.
Se invece hai pre-settled status come joining family member, quindi il tuo status è legato a quello di un familiare e non è basato sui tuoi diritti in quanto residente, allora potrai fare da sponsor a un familiare basandoti sulle leggi previste da Appendix FM solo dopo che hai ottenuto settled status.
Right. So when you want to sponsor someone for a partner visa, as you say, we've just we've covered the relationships that you have to be in. So you have to be married, civil partnership, etc., or fiance. The sponsor in the UK has to have that immigration status that can allow them to sponsor. And then you have a couple of extra rules, which include a financial requirement, an accommodation requirement, an English language requirement.
Quindi se vuoi sponsorizzare qualcuno che è il tuo partner, bisogna avere dei determinati requisiti, quali dei requisiti finanziari, deve esistere un alloggio idoneo per la coppia e il richiedente deve parlare inglese ad un livello soddisfacente.
Okay. I'm going to expand on each of those categories in a second, but just to highlight, there's a couple of other criteria to be aware of. Now, one is that there's a requirement for the couple to intend to live in the UK on a permanent basis. That doesn't mean that you have to commit to living in the UK forever and ever. It just means that your main place of residence when you're applying for the visa will be in the UK.
Un altro dei criteri è che la coppia deve avere intenzione di vivere in maniera permanente nel Regno Unito. Questo non vuol dire che la vostra intenzione è di vivere per sempre e in maniera definitiva nel Regno Unito. Bisogna solo dimostrare che la vostra intenzione è appunto di vivere insieme in UK.
Okay, and just the final thing to be aware of, and this applies to almost every visa you can make, is that there is always the suitability criteria that the Home Office will apply to everyone, and that means partners, students, workers, anything like that. And that's about, does the person have any kind of criminal convictions in their background? Have they ever been deported from the UK before, and things like that? So they will always make this assessment. And if any of those issues do affect you, then it's probably very important to speak to someone qualified, because you need to know what the likelihood of being granted the visa would be.
Un altro dei requisiti sono i cosiddetti suitability requirements, oppure requisito di idoneità, che riguarda principalmente l'esistenza di precedenti penali o deportazioni precedenti. Nel caso in cui doveste avere un problema riguardo i requisiti di idoneità, è meglio parlare con un qualified advisor, quindi con una persona specializzata nel campo.
Okay. Right. So just to look into a couple of those requirements in a little bit more detail. The main one that people usually takes the time to work through is the financial requirement, because what the rules say is that if someone wants to sponsor their partner or their other family members, including children, to come to the UK to live, then there needs to be enough money to support the family, however many people that includes, and that's where the financial requirement comes from.
Quindi è necessario soddisfare i requisiti finanziari ed è il caso in cui il richiedente vuole essere sponsorizzato poi per venire nel Regno Unito.
Okay, so there are two ways that the financial requirement can be satisfied, either if you're someone with sort of earnings or with savings or some kind of income, either from employment or from sort of investments, or if you rent properties and things like that. That's one way to meet the financial requirement.
Quindi ci sono due modi principali tramite il quale si può soddisfare i requisiti finanziari. Il primo è percepire il reddito minimo previsto, che si può soddisfare tramite un salario o lavoro autonomo, avere dei risparmi o degli investimenti ed eventuali pensioni.
Okay, I mean, the majority of people probably use a salaried income. It's the most straightforward way, because the rules are that you have to have an income of over 18,600 before you are taxed, and you have to have been working in that job for 6 months when you are sponsoring the person to come to the UK. So that's probably the most straightforward way to meet the financial requirement.
Probabilmente la maniera più diretta per soddisfare il requisito finanziario è quello del salario minimo previsto, che è intorno ai 18.600 pound, e bisogna dimostrare di percepire questo salario per un minimo di 6 mesi.
Okay, but sometimes people have a little bit more complicated situation, so they use a combination of different sources. So some people earn some money part-time, but it's not over 18,600, but they might have some kind of savings that they can also use in combination. So it can get a little bit more complicated, but there are different ways in meeting the financial requirement.
In alcuni casi la situazione del richiedente è lievemente più complessa, ma si può comunque utilizzare una combinazione di salario e risparmi per poter soddisfare appunto questo requisito.
Okay, now some people who, if they are in receipt of certain social security benefits, can still sort of meet the financial requirement if they have a certain type of benefit and they can still show that they have enough money. So it's a slightly different calculation if you're someone who's in receipt of a social security benefit, but you can still meet that financial threshold.
Si può soddisfare il requisito finanziario anche se la persona riceve determinati sussidi statali, ma bisogna appunto vedere se sono quelli previsti e si può comunque vedere la combinazione di altri requisiti finanziari per soddisfarlo.
Okay, the important thing to be aware of is that whichever way you're doing it, if you're doing it through your income, your salary, or if you're in receipt of a benefit that qualifies you, it's important that you have to submit with your application the evidence and the documents that the Home Office tells you to submit. If you don't submit things, even if you're working, but you forget to submit your pay slips from your work, the Home Office will say, well, you haven't proved to us that you've got the income, even if they could check with HMRC that you pay your tax. So it's very, very important that you always submit the documents that the Home Office requests. Otherwise, they just refuse because people didn't do what they told them to do, basically.
È estremamente importante fornire i documenti che l'Home Office vuole che tu fornisca. Questa viene chiamata specified evidence e questo perché se non fornisci i documenti che l'Home Office richiede, il tuo visto può essere rifiutato. Se ad esempio dici di lavorare e di avere un salario superiore ai 18.600 pound, devi fornire le pay slip.
Okay, so there's the two additional sort of main qualifying conditions are about having accommodation to live at and the English language requirement.
Dei requisiti in più sono il requisito dell'alloggio e della lingua inglese.
Okay, the accommodation requirement is essentially that you have somewhere to live that would be suitable for you and your family members and would not be considered to be overcrowded, and also that it's not paid for through public funds. So essentially you rent your accommodation or you own your own property is usually the way it works.
Avere un alloggio adeguato significa che hai un alloggio che può ospitare la famiglia intera e che non è sovraffollato in base al numero di familiari. E la cosa importante è che deve essere occupato o posseduto in maniera esclusiva e non devi essere l'occupante in base, scusate, perché percepisci i sussidi statali.
Okay. And then looking at the English language requirement, so everyone who's applying to come as a partner would normally be expected to show that they can speak English. And there's basically three ways that the Home Office will accept. One is that they come from an English-speaking country. The second one is that they have either done a degree in the UK or an English-speaking degree abroad. And the last way is that someone takes a test, an English language test that's approved by the Home Office.
Ci sono tre modi principali per soddisfare il requisito della conoscenza della lingua inglese. Il primo è di avere una nazionalità di un paese anglofono, secondo avere una laurea britannica ottenuta in seguito ad un corso equivalente in inglese, e il terzo invece è fare un esame di conoscenza di lingua inglese.
Okay. And the thing I've said, if in most people probably take the English language test approved by the Home Office, you can find a list of the tests on the Home Office website. But just to be aware is that when you make your initial application, they expect a certain level of English to be passed. But when you extend the visa, because you under the Appendix FM route, you have to extend your visa, the Home Office expects you to then take a test with a higher level of English to pass that. So they want to see this kind of progress in English once you've moved to the UK.
Molti probabilmente faranno l'esame di lingua inglese, ma è importante sottolineare il fatto che quando il visto viene esteso, il livello richiesto di lingua inglese aumenta. La lista di esami di inglese accettati poi si può trovare sul sito dell'Home Office.
Okay, all right. So that's the conditions covered, the most sort of straightforward way of meeting the conditions. Now, just a few things about the process. I want just to obviously there's costs. There's an application fee that has to be paid, and there is the NHS surcharge, so a payment to the NHS that has to be made when the person applies to the visa centre or makes an online application effectively.
Ci sono dei costi che bisogna affrontare. Il primo è una application fee, che è il costo per la richiesta stessa, e l'altro invece è la NHS surcharge, quindi il costo per il sistema sanitario nazionale.
Okay, and so you can see the high costs associated with applying, and that's why we tell people to make sure that they know they meet the rules when they apply, and they give the correct documents to the Home Office to show they meet the rules. And assuming that the person is granted, they will be given, if they're applying as the spouse or civil partner or the unmarried partner, if you've been living together for 2 years, you would be granted a visa for essentially 2 years and 9 months. That's what the visa is granted for.
Quindi potete vedere che i costi per richiedere un visto familiare sono estremamente elevati, per questo è importante assicurarsi di avere tutti i requisiti necessari prima di fare richiesta. Nel caso di un visto come partner, la durata è di 2 anni e 9 mesi iniziali.
Okay. If you're coming as a fiance and then you get married when you're here, you're granted 6 months to come here and then marry, and then after which you have to make an extension application whilst you're here.
Se invece fai richiesta in quanto fidanzato o fidanzata, avrai 6 mesi e dopodiché dovrai richiedere un'estensione del visto quando sei qui.
Okay. If someone doesn't succeed in their application, then usually they will have the right to appeal to an immigration tribunal to argue that they should have been granted a visa, or the alternative would be to make another application correcting the error that the Home Office says the person made. If they agree that there was an error in the application, you could correct the error and then make a new application. That's if you're not granted when you apply.
Se invece il visto viene rifiutato, quello che si può fare è fare innanzitutto appello all'Immigration Tribunal, oppure presentare una nuova domanda assicurandosi di presentarla correttamente.
Okay. Once someone is granted the visa and they come into the UK, they can then make an extension application. Before their visa runs out, they should apply. They apply from in the UK for an extension, which is granted for another 2.5 years. And then after they've completed 5 years of being in the UK under this as a partner, then they can apply to settlement for indefinite leave to remain.
Quindi si può chiedere il rinnovo del visto, che verrà garantito per ulteriori 2 anni e mezzo. E dopodiché si potrà ottenere il permesso indefinito dopo 5 anni totali.
Okay. And after someone is settled in the UK, once they have indefinite leave, they can apply to become a British citizen if they want to. There's no requirement to, but you can apply to become a British citizen after you've been granted settlement. Either you can apply immediately for British nationality, or you would have to wait for 12 months and then you can apply. Depends on your situation.
Dopo che una persona è settled nel Regno Unito, quindi ha indefinite leave to remain, può fare richiesta per la cittadinanza britannica immediatamente o dopo 12 mesi dall'ottenimento del settled status. Questo dipende dalle tue circostanze personali.
Okay. So that covers the most important things about partner visas. So we were going to look at student visas as well. So these, there are a number of different types of student visa, which I've listed there in the 5 sub-points. We are mainly going to look at the university level student visas, because that's the one that's the most common that people apply for, is to go and study at a UK university.
Allora, adesso andremo a vedere i requisiti per fare richiesta come studenti. Ci sono diversi tipi di visti disponibili in base al livello di studi, ma quello che andremo ad approfondire è quello per gli studenti universitari.
Okay, and the important thing to know and remember again about student visas is the application must be made before the person comes to the UK. They must be granted the visa before they come to the UK. And with a student visa, there's a sponsor, like there was a sponsor in the family member application, but with a student visa, the sponsor is the university, and they issue the student confirmation that the student will be studying at that university once they've been granted the visa.
Di nuovo è importante fare la richiesta per il visto prima di arrivare nel Regno Unito e di averlo garantito prima di venire nel Regno Unito. Anche in questo caso ci sarà uno sponsor, ma lo sponsor sarà l'università.
Okay, and again, the Home Office, they have a list on their website of all of the universities and colleges in the UK who have a license to sponsor students to come and study in the UK.
E sul sito dell'Home Office si può trovare la lista di università e college che hanno il permesso di fare da sponsor agli studenti.
Okay. Right, so again, we're looking at those the student visas for essentially for universities. Now, it's important, again, there's these kind of eligibility conditions. You have to have sponsorship from the university, and the sponsorship will confirm that the course that you intend to study is of an acceptable, like it's of the correct level that is required. That the person coming to study has to show that they have enough funds to cover the cost of their course and for the cost of living in the UK whilst they're studying. There is an English language requirement, again, similar to what we had before. And as I said, almost every visa application has this suitability requirement, which applies, of course, to anyone wanting to study as well.
Bisogna provare di avere la sponsorship adeguata. L'università poi confermerà il livello di studi corretto. Bisogna anche dimostrare di avere abbastanza fondi per coprire il corso di studi e anche per vivere nel Regno Unito. Inoltre bisogna avere, oltre che a questi eligibility requirements, anche soddisfare i suitability requirements, quindi i requisiti dell'idoneità di cui abbiamo parlato prima.
So just going in a little bit more detail about those requirements. So in terms of studying in the UK, when you apply for that visa, you have to show you have enough money to pay for the course for up to 9 months for an academic year of the course. Obviously, university courses are 3 years long, but you have to show you have at least enough money to cover that first year of studying, and that you have enough money to live in the UK for that first academic year of studying. So that's money that has to be in your bank account when you make the application.
Per prima cosa bisogna dimostrare di avere abbastanza denaro per pagare il tuo corso e per un anno accademico. Questo denaro deve essere nel tuo conto corrente.
Okay, and then the English language requirement has to be, and you can pass that in one of three ways. Either, again, one of these approved English language tests, Home Office approves. If you have done any of your schooling in the UK and you've done GCSEs or above that at a UK school when you were under 18, you can see that in the condition, that's enough to show you speak English, or the university can assess you themselves and say, when they sponsor you, they all say to the Home Office, we think this person speaks English to a high enough level to take the course.
Ci sono vari modi per soddisfare il requisito della conoscenza della lingua inglese. La prima è fare un test di inglese approvato, qua nella slide lo potete vedere, è il SELT, oppure se hai un GCSE, quindi se hai fatto i tuoi studi nel Regno Unito e avevi meno di 18 anni, puoi verificarlo. E la terza maniera è che l'università esaminerà e dirà all'Home Office che il richiedente ha un livello di inglese adeguato.
Okay, so in terms of the sort of the costs and what to do if the application is successful or unsuccessful, we have an application fee of £363 when you're applying for the visa, and the NHS charge, which again applies but is a little bit lower for students, is £470 for each year of the visa. So if you're studying for 3 years, 3 times that. However, the UK has an agreement with the EU that students with a European health insurance card can be refunded the cost of that NHS charge so they pay it, but they can be refunded it at a later stage.
Come potete vedere i costi sono mostrati nella slide. L'application fee è di £363 e ancora l'immigration health surcharge è di £470, che tuttavia grazie a degli accordi coloro che hanno una European Health Insurance card potrebbero avere il costo del NHS surcharge rimborsato.
Okay, just one point about that is that the health charge, there's a website that tells you about being refunded the NHS charge, and you can only be refunded it. You have to have a European health insurance card that covers the period of your study, or if you had to renew your health card, then you have to have 2 or 3 that covers the length of your study, and you're not allowed to work whilst you're in the UK in order to be able to access that refund. Okay, so there are some extra conditions that you would want to check.
Ci sono delle condizioni aggiuntive che bisogna soddisfare. Una di queste è che la European Health Insurance Card deve coprire i determinati anni di corso accademico. Quindi va verificato, bisogna vedere bene il sito dell'Home Office e non si può lavorare.
Okay. So if you're granted a student visa, you're granted a visa that will last the length of your course, and that you'll have a little bit of time before the course starts that you can come to the UK, and you'll have a little bit of time after the course finishes so that you can move to the UK. And if you're leaving at the end of your course, you have enough time to move away. So that's how long student visas are granted for. It depends on the length of the course.
Quindi la durata del visto dipende dalla durata del corso. Avrai un po' di tempo all'inizio e poi anche alla fine, quindi il periodo può anche variare.
Okay. If the student visa application isn't successful, you can apply for something called an administrative review if you can show that the Home Office made the wrong decision, or again, as I said with the previous Appendix FM visas, you can correct whatever is wrong with the application and submit a new one to the visa, to get a visa approved that way.
In caso di un rifiuto, quello che si può fare è inviare un administrative review nel caso in cui l'Home Office ha sbagliato a rifiutare il visto, oppure puoi inoltrare una nuova richiesta correggendo gli errori fatti.
Okay. Once you're in the UK studying, so your visa will be limited to your course length. Now, people can extend student visas to carry on studying if they want to, but they would have to show, if they want to stay in the UK studying, that they are progressing academically. And what that means in a certain sense is that you couldn't stay studying at the same level if you want to extend your visa. So if you've done an undergraduate degree, then generally you have to go up to the next level if you want to stay. So you to take a postgraduate degree, because the Home Office doesn't want people just to stay studying at the same level.
Una volta nel Regno Unito, come abbiamo detto, il visto sarà della durata del tuo corso. Si può eventualmente anche estendere questo visto turistico, ma quello che l'Home Office vuole vedere è una progressione accademica, quindi non puoi studiare sempre allo stesso livello, devi progredire.
Okay. The other alternative, if you want to remain in the UK, of course, many students leave at the end of their studies, but if you want to stay and you have been studying at undergraduate level or above, then you can apply for a graduate visa to stay in the UK. And the graduate visa allows you to stay in the UK for 2 years after your student visa finishes, and you can work for any company, UK-based company, whilst you're here. And effectively it gives you just the right to kind of establish to carry on working in the UK, to move into that stage. But what you have to be aware of with the graduate visa is that when it comes to the end of the 2 years, you can't extend the graduate visa. So at the end of those 2 years, if you want to stay, you would need to then apply for another type of visa to remain in the UK, maybe something like a skilled worker visa, something along those lines.
Un'altra possibilità è richiedere lo Skilled Worker Visa oppure un visto per laureati, quindi un Graduate Visa. Tuttavia il Graduate Visa non ti dà la possibilità di rimanere in maniera indefinita e quindi di avere poi il Settled, quindi eventualmente bisogna vedere anche in quel caso la possibilità di avere uno Skilled Worker.
Yeah, and some people, if you finish your undergraduate studies, postgraduate studies, and you could move straight into a skilled working visa if you have the opportunity. If you've got sponsorship from a UK company, you don't have to go for a graduate visa. But the point is that at the end of your student visa, you need to do something. You either need to extend the student visa, apply graduate, or apply for another visa if you want to stay in the UK. Otherwise, obviously, you'd be expected to leave the UK before your student visa expired.
Il punto è che bisogna fare qualcosa prima che il visto studentesco scada, e questo può essere chiedere un graduate visa, quindi un visto per laureati, oppure uno skilled worker. Altrimenti, se il visto scade, dovrai lasciare il Regno Unito.
Okay, so that's covered. There are some, I've created some hyperlinks which hopefully we can circulate just for the kind of with a bit more information. It's guidance that's provided by the Home Office, but as I say, I've said it a number of times, if you're not sure or if you want some clarity about how you might qualify for the visa, talk to someone who is regulated and has the qualification to explain it, because what we've talked about there is a really simplistic sort of way that it works, and there can be things that add complications in that you may need to discuss further.
Qua ci sono alcuni link molto utili, però il punto principale è che questa presentazione è solo un riassunto di quello che è un visto turistico, studentesco, i suoi requisiti, e il visto familiare, i suoi requisiti. È molto importante parlare con una persona qualificata per dare consigli in materia di immigrazione, per poi vedere quali sono le tue possibilità reali. Okay, Questa era la fine della presentazione, adesso passiamo a domande e risposte. So this was the end of this presentation, but now we go straight to our Q&A session. The first question, quindi la prima domanda è: mia moglie è arrivata nel Regno Unito come turista nel 2019, ma quando il suo visto è scaduto non ha lasciato il Regno Unito. Ci siamo sposati 7 mesi fa e vorremmo sapere cosa possiamo fare per regolarizzare la sua posizione.
Okay, thanks. I think so. Just to be clear, when we answer, well, I answer things about family relationships, I'm going to assume that there is no, or that they cannot be sponsored under the EU settlement scheme, or from the facts, because otherwise it would be too complicated to cover both applying under the settlement scheme and the Appendix FM that we've talked about. So, but sometimes, I mean, people would potentially need to look at the settlement scheme, family relationships first, and then if you don't meet that, then you can look at Appendix FM. But we'll cover what you would do under Appendix FM for the purposes of answering these questions. Okay.
Quindi daremo per scontato, quando rispondiamo a questa domanda, che il richiedente non ha i requisiti necessari per inoltrare una domanda sotto l'UE Settlement Scheme, ma è importante verificare che questi requisiti non esistano prima di inoltrare una richiesta sotto Appendix FM.
Yeah, so because this couple got married in 2000, so 7 months ago, so beginning of this year, 2022. Essentially, if the wife in this scenario doesn't have any status because she came as a visitor and she doesn't seem to have any other status, then she will have to leave the UK to apply for a visa to re-enter the country, because you cannot apply under the Appendix FM route if you don't have status already, or if you're here as a visitor. So if that's your scenario, the main way that it has to be resolved is for the person to leave the UK to apply for the correct entry permission, and then once they have the visa issued, they can come back. But of course, in the application, they will potentially have to explain that they've been in the UK and they overstayed the visiting visa, and they'll have to explain that situation as part of the application. So in this example, the person, I would strongly recommend that they discuss this with someone qualified before they make that application, to make sure that they can explain that what's happened and avoid being refused because the person overstayed their visiting permission.
Quindi, dato che il richiedente ha oltrepassato il limite permesso dal suo visto turistico, è importante innanzitutto che chieda aiuto ad una persona specializzata nel campo. Dato che si sono sposati quest'anno, sarebbe opportuno che il richiedente lasciasse il Regno Unito e facesse una richiesta per un visto dall'estero.
Next question.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, for replying. Can we pass to the second question?
Yes, please.
Ok, quindi la seconda domanda è: il visto di mio figlio è stato rifiutato perché non soddisfa i requisiti finanziari previsti. C'è qualche rimedio? Sono un genitore single e mio figlio vive all'estero con mia madre anziana.
Yeah, okay. This is a very difficult question to answer, except to sort of say it will potentially depend on the circumstances, because obviously the Home Office is of the view that the mother in this scenario doesn't meet that financial requirement. So even though I was talking about the financial requirement for partners, there is it applies to children in a slightly different way. But the point is, if the Home Office says no, you don't have enough funds to sponsor your child, that potentially could be a legitimate ground for saying that the child can't have a visa, but it will potentially also depend on the circumstances. There may be alternative arguments that could be made about the situation of that family. It will completely depend on what that person's situation is, why the child is living with the mother rather than in the UK, and things like that. So it's really hard to say whether there might be a successful outcome, but again, it's one that's, because it's complicated, would need to be talked through with a qualified advisor.
Anche in questo caso dipende molto dalle circostanze ed è opportuno chiedere assistenza ad una persona specializzata. I requisiti per i bambini sono leggermente diversi e bisogna appunto vedere se esiste una soluzione alternativa per il bambino, ma appunto è difficile dirlo in questo momento e dipende dalla situazione personale, dalle circostanze personali della famiglia.
Okay.
Ok, so we can go to question 3. Passiamo alla domanda numero 3. Ho presetto status garantito sotto l'UE Settlement Scheme. Mia moglie e io abbiamo cittadinanza italiana. Ci siamo sposati civilmente nel maggio del 2021, ma la cerimonia religiosa è stata fatta a settembre del 2020. La domanda di presetto status di mia moglie è stata rifiutata. Perché? Cosa possiamo fare per vivere insieme nel Regno Unito?
Okay, so this is one where I will have to talk a little bit about Appendix EU, the EU settlement scheme, because it's obviously the person's applied under that. Now, what the Home Office is essentially saying is that because your legal marriage took place after the end of 2020, your spouse, your wife, she does not meet the conditions to be considered a spouse under the EU settlement scheme. So that's what they're saying. Now, when that happens, you have to assess whether you could be considered under the settlement scheme to be unmarried partners by the end of 2020. So in a serious relationship by the end of 2020. That's how you would have to argue your application under the settlement scheme.
Quindi è necessario innanzitutto, scusate, in questa risposta dovremo parlare un attimino dell'UE Settlement Scheme, quindi in questo caso il richiedente non può fare domanda in quanto coniuge all'interno dell'UE Settlement Scheme, ma bisogna vedere se ha i requisiti in quanto unmarried partner, quindi come durable partner.
Okay, now whether you can show that you're a durable partner, that will depend on how long your relationship existed for before the end of 2020, and whether all the facts about whether you've lived together, whether you can show that you were in a serious relationship with evidence. Now, hopefully you can do that because the EU settlement scheme is free and it's a bit more, it's an easier path to get your now wife settled in the UK. But if you can't meet those conditions, if you cannot succeed for your wife under the settlement scheme, then you would have to look at the Appendix FM partner rules that we talked about through this session about meeting those conditions, because obviously she's now your wife, so she could apply under Appendix FM, but only if, I would say, you would only do that if the settlement scheme application is not going to work for you both.
Prima di tutto andremo a vedere se ci sono i requisiti sotto l'UE Settlement Scheme, questo perché la richiesta è gratuita, quando invece sotto Appendix FM è a pagamento e abbiamo già visto che questi sono elevati. Quindi bisogna vedere se si hanno i requisiti in quanto durable partner, quindi come partner duraturo. E questo bisogna andare a vedere se si hanno i requisiti della convivenza sotto l'UE Settlement Scheme, altrimenti bisogna poi andare a vedere quelli di Appendix FM.
Okay, yeah, so I think that's the
yes, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Adesso passiamo alla domanda numero 4. Mio papà ha un precedente penale risalente al 1999. Adesso è malato e richiede la mia assistenza a causa di una grave malattia. Questo precedente penale andrà ad influire sulla richiesta per un visto familiare?
Yeah, so I think, again, I'm going to have to guess a little bit here, but I'm assuming that this is an application to sponsor the person's father under the EU settlement scheme. I think, rather than because there is a category under the Appendix FM route to sponsor parents, but it's very limiting. Like, it's very, very, very difficult to sponsor a parent under Appendix FM, even when they're ill, because you have to show that almost they cannot access any healthcare in the place they're currently living. So it's very limited. If it's about sponsoring the father under the EU settlement scheme, then the sponsor would need to show that the father is dependent on them. And again, he's citing a difficult illness. So it may be that he's applying under the settlement scheme. I'll let you translate that, then I'll complete the answer.
Dato che sotto Appendix FM le richieste in quanto familiare, adulto e dipendente sono veramente complesse, difficili, anche se una persona è malata. È molto difficile ottenere un visto come appunto adult dependent partner. Chris andrà a discutere anche gli settlement scheme e quindi i requisiti in quanto dependent parent.
So assuming that we're sponsoring under the EU settlement scheme, so the fact that the father has a conviction can be taken into account. So the Home Office will ask about information about it, and they will assess the conviction, and so it then depends obviously on the seriousness of the conviction and what happened, any sentence that was issued to your father. So if it is not a serious criminal offence, then it should be it should not in theory you can still qualify for a visa. If it's a serious offence, there might be more difficulty in being granted. You have the if the Home Office refuses on the grounds of the conviction, you can appeal that and argue that the wrong decision was made. But it will all depend on the type of conviction and the facts surrounding it, because obviously it was quite a long time ago. So potentially the fact that some time has passed, it could be argued in favor of your father, but it still will depend on the type of conviction.
Quindi il fatto che tuo papà abbia un precedente penale risalente al 1999 può essere sì considerato dall'Home Office e andare ad influire eventualmente sul risultato, ma ciò che bisogna fare è fornire le informazioni necessarie all'Home Office e l'Home Office le chiederà. E tutto dipenderà dalla serietà di questo precedente penale. Se il precedente non è serio, puoi ancora avere i requisiti. Se invece è serio, può portare ad un eventuale rifiuto, e a quel punto bisogna poi fare eventuali appelli o administrative review, dipende comunque dalla motivazione di questo esito. Okay. Thank you, Chris, for replying to this question. We can pass to the question number 5. Come fa l'Home Office a raccogliere informazioni riguardo la mia frequentazione universitaria? Posso lavorare con un visto studentesco? Questo può cambiare in base al corso al quale mi sono iscritto, full time o part time?
Okay, so the first part of the question in terms of how does the Home Office collect data about your university attendance, the university, as they have a license from the Home Office to sponsor international students, the Home Office imposes obligations on the university, including reporting when international students, if they don't attend X amount of their university course, then the university has to report it to the Home Office. So there's an obligation on the university.
Quindi, dato che l'università ha un permesso per fare da sponsor, ha anche degli obblighi verso l'Home Office. Tra questi obblighi c'è anche il dovere di dare informazioni relative alla frequenza dello studente. Quindi se non frequenti l'università, l'università stessa ha il dovere di dirlo all'Home Office.
Yeah, and the answer to the about working is that yes, sometimes students can work on a student visa. If you're a full-time student, then you are given an allowance of work. It's limited when you're within your term time, because obviously you're not supposed to be working as your main activity. You're supposed to be a full-time student, but when you're in the holidays, you can work on a full-time basis. So you do need to check, because it does depend on what level you're studying and things like that. But in principle, yes, with certain student visas, working is permitted alongside the studying activity. But then do remember what I said about the European health insurance card, because you couldn't claim a refund of the NHS charges if you did undertake any work whilst you were studying.
Quindi in alcuni casi si può studiare durante il corso di studi o durante la pausa. Questo dipende da quello che viene concesso dal tuo visto, ma ricordiamoci ancora della European Health Insurance Card, che non permette di lavorare, che non permette in alcuni casi di lavorare. Okay. So we can pass to the last question, quindi passiamo all'ultima domanda. Presto inizierò un corso di laurea triennale a Manchester e ho già ottenuto il visto per studenti. Posso stare nel Regno Unito anche dopo la fine del corso? È possibile estendere il mio visto?
Yeah, okay. Now, hopefully, this question was answered when we did the presentation, but obviously it doesn't hurt to repeat what was said. So they're undertaking a bachelor, so an undergraduate degree. So they could potentially extend the student visa once they finish that studying, if they are progressing academically, so i.e. moving up to a master's degree or above, or once they finished the bachelor's degree, they could switch into a graduate visa, which gives them 2 years of working permission. So it will depend what they want to do at the end of the undergraduate. If they want to carry on studying, then it's appropriate to apply for another student visa. If they want to move into employment, then it will be probably the best route will be to go for a graduate visa at that point.
Come abbiamo detto prima, si può eventualmente estendere il visto, però naturalmente bisogna mostrare di progredire a livello accademico. Si può in alcuni casi cambiare per un graduate visa, quindi un visto per laureati o uno skilled worker, ma appunto dipende da che cosa si vuole fare, quali sono i tuoi requisiti. Ok, so this was our last question. Questa era l'ultima domanda. Sono le 7:30, quindi abbiamo finito il nostro incontro. It's over 7:30, so I think we run out of time. I can see that there are some questions, but I believe that they can all email us. Potete inviarci eventualmente un'email ad advice@settled.org.uk. Chris, thank you very much for replying to all our questions and for the great presentation. Grazie per le domande e per la presentazione fantastica. But thank you very much to all the participants. Grazie a tutti coloro che hanno partecipato e ci hanno ascoltato. Noi rimaniamo qui. Doveste avere qualsiasi domanda, per favore inviateci un'email.